As The Rock walked through the park, he felt at peace. The sky was clear, the sun was shining, and the sounds of birds chirping filled the air. People were jogging along the paths, children were laughing, and families were enjoying their day. The Rock, for a moment, felt like just another person in the crowd, blending in with everyone around him. He was dressed casually, trying to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. He had earned his fame and success, but today he just wanted to be a regular person. The Rock strolled along the park's trails, taking in the beauty of the surroundings. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly. The scent of fresh grass filled the air, and the peaceful hum of the park made him feel calm. He walked for a few minutes before he spotted a bench under a large, shady tree. It seemed like the perfect spot to rest for a while, so he decided to sit down and take in the tranquility of the park. He settled onto the bench, stretching out his legs and letting out a contented sigh. His mind drifted, reflecting on how far he had come in life. From a young athlete to a global superstar, he had worked hard to achieve his dreams. But today none of that mattered. It was just him and the peaceful world around him. He closed his eyes for a moment and let himself relax, enjoying the beauty of nature. But as he sat there, something began to feel off. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. The Rock opened his eyes and glanced around. His gaze settled on a small group of children playing soccer nearby, their laughter filling the air. He smiled at them, their joy reminding him of simpler times. His attention then shifted to a father and his son, both engrossed in the game. The father smiled at The Rock, and The Rock returned the gesture with a friendly wave. For that brief moment, everything seemed perfect. It was a simple, happy interaction, and it lifted The Rock's spirits. He looked back at the father and son for a moment longer, grateful for the connection. He felt reminded that, no matter how big his career had become, moments like these were what really mattered. However, despite the warm interaction, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He scanned the area again, and this time he saw the police officer. Officer Blake, who was patrolling the park, was sitting in his squad car with his eyes fixed on The Rock. Blake's reputation in the area was well known, and it wasn't a good one. The officer was known for being aggressive, prejudiced, and quick to pick fights. His history of bullying people, especially black people, was infamous. As soon as his eyes landed on The Rock sitting on the bench, he saw an opportunity to flex his power. He thought to himself, here's a big guy just sitting here looking like he's up to no good. I'll show him who's in charge. Officer Blake made a decision. He started his car and drove it toward a nearby parking spot, the screech of the tires announcing his arrival. With a confident stride, he stepped out of the car and began walking toward The Rock. His posture was stiff, his face hard with anger, and his whole body radiated an air of superiority. The Rock noticed the officer approaching and prepared himself. He had no intention of causing trouble, but he also wasn't about to let anyone treat him with disrespect. He kept his body relaxed and his expression calm as the officer closed the distance between them. "Hey!" Officer Blake shouted, his voice loud and demanding. "You can't sit here. This bench is off limits today." The Rock was taken aback for a moment. His eyes narrowed slightly, trying to understand what the officer meant. He knew that this was a public park, and benches were not reserved for anyone in particular. But he stayed calm, looking the officer directly in the eye. "Off limits?" The Rock asked in a steady voice. "It's a public park. I'm just sitting here like everyone else. What's the problem?" Blake's face twisted in frustration. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone who was challenging his authority. He stepped closer, his body language becoming more aggressive. "Don't talk back to me," Blake growled. "I said move now." He pointed a finger at The Rock, trying to force him into submission. His voice was filled with menace, and his whole stance was threatening. The Rock could feel the tension rising in the air. He knew that this situation could escalate quickly, but he refused to let it get out of hand. He had been in tough situations before, both in the ring and in life, but he didn't want any trouble today. Slowly, he stood up from the bench, his muscles rippling as he rose to his full height. He wasn't backing down, but he wasn't making any sudden movements either. "I don't want any trouble, officer," The Rock said calmly. "I'm just here to enjoy the day. There's no need for this to escalate." He maintained eye contact with the officer, his voice even and respectful. He wasn't about to let Blake bully him, but he also wasn't looking for a fight. The Rock kept his body relaxed, showing that he was in control of the situation, no matter how tense it was. As The Rock walked away from the bench, he tried to put some distance between himself and the officer. He noticed the young boy with the soccer ball again. The ball had rolled toward Officer Blake and the boy was running after it. But before the boy could reach the ball, Officer Blake grabbed it out of the air, cutting off the boy's path. The boy stopped, confused and unsure of what to do next. Officer Blake glared at him and with a sneer he said, "Maybe you should go play somewhere else. This park is for people who know how to behave." The boy's eyes widened with fear. He didn't understand why the officer was being so mean to him. The boy's dad, seeing what was happening, rushed over to the scene. His face was full of concern as he placed himself between his son and the officer. "Is there a problem, officer?" the father asked, his voice steady. "We're just playing a game." The officer didn't care about the father's calm and reasonable words. Instead, his eyes hardened and he stepped closer to the father, his body tense. "Are you questioning my authority?" he spat. "You don't know who you're talking to. I'm the law around here and you'd better remember that." The Rock was watching this whole situation unfold, and he could feel the anger rising inside him. He had hoped to stay out of it, but this wasn't just some small disagreement anymore. It was clear that Officer Blake was abusing his power and targeting people who didn't deserve it. The Rock could see the fear in the father's eyes and the hurt in the boy's face, and he knew he had to step in. The Rock took a deep breath and then walked over to the officer. "Officer," he said, his voice firm and steady, "the kid just wants his ball. Let's not make this worse than it has to be." Blake looked at the Rock, his face twisted with contempt. "Oh, you think you can tell me how to do my job?" he sneered. "You people always think you're above the rules. You think you're special just because you're big and famous?" Blake's words stung, but the Rock didn't let them get to him. He wasn't there to argue with the officer. He was there to protect the boy and his dad from unnecessary cruelty. He stood tall and looked the officer in the eyes. "Just let the kid have his ball," the Rock said, his tone unwavering. "There's no need for any of this to go further." But the officer was beyond reason. In a swift, practiced move, he pulled a rubber bullet gun from his holster and aimed it at the Rock. The officer's finger was already on the trigger, his eyes blazing with anger. The tension in the air became thick, as though time itself had slowed down. "Back off or I'll put you down," Blake growled, his voice full of rage. His finger twitched on the trigger, and his whole body was shaking with the intensity of the moment. The Rock stood his ground, his posture calm but ready. He wasn't afraid of the rubber bullets. He wasn't afraid of the officer. The Rock's body was strong, but it was his mind that was sharp. He knew how to handle dangerous situations, and this was no different. The officer was ready to strike, but the Rock wasn't going to let him get away with it. He was determined to stop the officer from making a huge mistake. The Rock stood tall and firm. His body was as strong as a rock, and his calmness made him seem even more powerful. He wasn't scared or worried at all. Officer Blake, on the other hand, was full of anger and rage. His fists were clenched and his eyes burned with hatred. The two men were standing face to face in front of a crowd of people who had gathered to watch the confrontation. The crowd was tense, like a string pulled too tight, about to snap. People gasped when they saw the situation unfolding. The tension in the air was thick, like everyone was holding their breath. Some of the people in the crowd began to take a step back, not sure if things were going to get violent. Some mothers pulled their children closer, protecting them from the possibility of danger. Fathers moved their families behind them. The crowd was scared and unsure of what was going to happen next. The Rock didn't seem afraid. His face was calm and he spoke with a voice that was steady and clear. His words cut through the tension like a knife. "Are you really going to shoot an unarmed man?" he asked, his voice calm but full of disbelief. He didn't seem scared at all. He was trying to reason with Blake, trying to stop things before they got worse. "Is this what this is all about? Are you so desperate to prove a point?" The Rock's voice didn't waver. He was unshaken by the anger in Blake's eyes. Blake, however, was a man full of rage. He was angry and frustrated, and when the Rock spoke, it only made him angrier. The officer's face twisted in fury and he gritted his teeth. He couldn't believe that someone, especially someone as big as the Rock, would stand up to him like this. The crowd held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Without warning, Blake pulled the trigger of his gun. A rubber bullet shot out of it, aimed directly at the Rock's chest. The crowd gasped in shock, their hearts racing as they waited for the bullet to hit. But when the bullet struck the Rock's chest, something unbelievable happened. The bullet bounced off, harmlessly rolling to the ground. It didn't even make him flinch. The Rock stood there unmoved. His body was so strong that the rubber bullet couldn't hurt him. His expression didn't change. He remained calm and composed. The people watching were stunned. They couldn't believe what they had just seen. The crowd let out a collective gasp, and some people even whispered to each other in disbelief. The Rock hadn't even reacted to the attack. He was so strong that the bullet didn't even leave a mark on him. Blake, however, wasn't sure what to do now. His eyes were wide with surprise. He had expected his attack to hurt the Rock, to make him back down. But it hadn't worked. The Rock wasn't scared or hurt. Instead, he just stood there like nothing had happened. This made Blake even more angry but also a little scared. He had underestimated the Rock. The Rock, still calm and unshaken, looked at Blake and raised an eyebrow. A small, sarcastic smile appeared on his face. "Was that supposed to hurt?" he asked, his voice dripping with amusement. His words were like a jab, mocking Blake's failed attempt to intimidate him. The crowd watched, shocked and impressed at how easily the Rock handled the attack. It was clear now that Blake was no match for the Rock's strength. The crowd started to cheer, but Blake only got angrier. The Rock had turned the situation around, showing that he was the stronger, more powerful person in this confrontation. He was the one who was calm and in control. Blake was the one who looked weak now, and it only made him more furious. The Rock didn't just stand there though. He slowly started to move toward Blake, taking a step forward. His body was huge and his every movement was filled with power. As the Rock took a step closer, his shadow seemed to grow, stretching over Blake like a cloud blocking the sun. Blake felt the fear growing inside of him. He didn't know what to do. He had thought he could intimidate the Rock, but now he realized he was the one who was scared. The Rock's voice lowered, becoming almost a growl. "You want to use violence?" he asked, his words full of dark intent. "Let me show you what that feels like." His voice was full of promise, but not the good kind. It was a warning, and Blake could feel it deep inside. He took a small step back, but the Rock was too fast. Before Blake could even react, the Rock grabbed the gun from his hands, easily disarming him. With one quick motion, the Rock snapped the rubber bullet gun in half. The pieces of the broken gun fell to the ground, useless. Blake stood there, stunned, not sure what had just happened. He had been ready to fight, but now he was standing there empty-handed, his bravado shattered. The crowd was amazed at how effortlessly the Rock had taken control of the situation. They could see that Blake was no longer in charge. Blake, still trying to save face, blurted out, "You're assaulting an officer." His voice was trembling now, filled with fear. He was looking around for a way out, but there was no way to escape. The crowd had seen everything and they were watching closely. Blake had thought that his badge would protect him, but now he realized he had made a huge mistake. The Rock's expression didn't change. He didn't look angry or upset. He just looked determined. His eyes were locked on Blake as he spoke, his voice cold and firm. "No," he replied, his words slow and deliberate. "I'm teaching you respect." His voice was full of judgment, and it made the crowd feel like they were witnessing something important. The Rock wasn't just standing up for himself, he was standing up for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. The Rock's hand gripped Blake's collar and with ease, he lifted him off the ground. Blake's feet dangled in the air, and the crowd gasped at the display of strength. The Rock was so strong that he didn't even break a sweat. Blake, once so full of arrogance, now seemed small and helpless in the Rock's grasp. "Look at these people," the Rock said, his voice low and steady. He gestured to the crowd, who had been watching the entire thing. "The ones you harass, intimidate, and belittle. Do they deserve the way you treat them?" His words cut through the air like a knife. The crowd was silent, each person reflecting on the power of the Rock's words. They knew he was right. Blake had abused his power, and now the Rock was showing him what it felt like to be at the mercy of someone stronger. The crowd, once quiet, began to cheer. Their voices grew louder and louder, filling the air with a sense of victory. They had witnessed justice, and they were proud of the Rock for standing up to Blake. They had all felt the pain of injustice, and now they saw someone powerful taking action. The crowd cheered for the Rock, shouting their support for him as he stood there, holding Blake up like a rag doll. Blake, humiliated and desperate, tried to punch the Rock. His fists flew wild and uncoordinated, but the Rock was too fast. With lightning speed, he caught Blake's fist in midair. The officer's face twisted in shock and pain as the Rock's grip tightened around his hand. The Rock twisted Blake's arm, forcing him to his knees with a sharp crack. The crowd gasped, their eyes wide in amazement. "You think a badge makes you untouchable?" The Rock growled, his voice full of contempt. "It doesn't. Respect is earned, not demanded." His words were like a punch to the gut, and Blake could feel the weight of them pressing down on him. He had always thought that his badge made him powerful, but now he saw that it meant nothing. The Rock had shown him that true power comes from respect, not fear. The crowd cheered again, their voices rising in support of the Rock's message. They knew that what he was doing was important. They knew that this was a moment of justice, a moment when someone had stood up against abuse of power. They were all on The Rock's side now. Blake, on the ground, was defeated. His pride was gone, and his strength had failed him. He was nothing compared to The Rock. The officer swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He realized that he had been wrong all along. The badge didn't protect him, and the power he had once felt was now gone. Just then, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Police cars screeched to a halt around the park, their lights flashing brightly. Officers poured out of the cars, their weapons drawn, unsure of what was happening. The crowd shouted out explanations, waving their phones and showing the officers the videos they had recorded. Each video was clear evidence of Blake's wrongdoing, showing exactly what had happened. The officers, seeing the truth in the videos, quickly turned their attention to Blake. "You're under arrest for misconduct and assault," one of the officers said. He grabbed Blake and handcuffed him, hauling him to his feet. Blake didn't resist. He couldn't. The Rock had already shown him who was in charge. As the sun set, The Rock returned home, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. He had done the right thing and now he could relax. At home, his family was waiting for him. He sank into his favorite chair, letting out a deep breath. The news was already covering the event, and his story was going viral. People were praising him for standing up to Officer Blake. He was called a hero, a champion of justice, and a role model for standing up against racism and discrimination. Clara, his daughter, was excited. She handed him her phone, laughing. "Dad, you're all over the internet again," she said, pointing to the screen where a tweet showed The Rock disarming Blake. The tweet had thousands of likes and retweets. The Rock smiled and took the phone from her. He scrolled through the comments and saw people calling him a hero. He felt proud but also humbled. "Maybe this time, people will remember that respect goes both ways," The Rock said, handing the phone back to Clara. "But I think they'll have a hard time forgetting this one." The Rock leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment. He knew that what he had done had made a difference. It wasn't just about the fight, it was about standing up for what was right. And sometimes that's the greatest victory of all. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe for more stories. I'll see you in the next video.